All right, so in this video, I'm gonna walk you through painting 4 of these small little landscape studies. I'm gonna take you through step by step and kind of explain my thought process behind each decision that I make. Hello and welcome to Paint Coach. My name is Chris Fornatero, and I'm here to help simplify oil painting so that you can get better faster. So I've talked about doing small, simple little landscape studies like this before. Honestly, it's become one of my new favorite things to do. They are just so much fun. You get so much out of them in such a short amount of time. They just really cut straight to what makes a landscape painting work. There's not a lot of details, so you're not gonna get caught up in all of that. And trust me, if you can make these little 4x5 inch paintings work, you can make a larger painting work. In fact, I highly recommend if you plan on painting a larger landscape to do a couple of these first. Even paint the same scene that you're planning on painting on the big canvas on one of these. Work out all the problems in these tiny little paintings. That way you're not trying to solve them on a big painting with a lot of paint where it's gonna be a lot more difficult. All right, so let's jump on into these paintings. The first one's a photo that I took a while ago in Laguna Beach. And this is just gonna be a lot of atmospheric perspective here of getting each one of these little land masses coming out into the water to look like they're actually behind the other one and further in space. So I'm gonna pause it right here on the drawing, just explain a couple things. First off, I was conscious not to make each landmass come out to the same distance out into the ocean. You know, I wasn't caring about what the photo looked like. I was more concerned with the composition here. And we got a great composition. We got these little rocks in the foreground and then the shoreline that leads us up to our first landmass, which leads us to the middle one and then to the last one. But getting back to these little land masses coming out into the water, I feel a lot of beginners would have brought each one out to the same distance into the water, and you don't want to do that. Anytime you have repeating objects or repeating shapes, you want to vary them up in size and distance. Also note the distance of each little piece of ocean as we get back. I made sure to vary all those distances up as well. All right, so the first thing I want to do is establish the relationship of these 3 main pieces of land, and I want them to progressively look further away. This is atmospheric perspective. If you don't know, atmospheric perspective is the idea that as things get further away from you, certain colors drop out. First it's yellows, then reds, and then you're left with blues. Also, things are gonna get lighter as they get further away. They're gonna get more desaturated in color. The contrast is gonna get less. So I'm keeping that in mind as I block out the darks of these 3 masses. You can see the one in the foreground here is a lot darker. You get further back, it's a little more purple. In the middle here, not as dark. And then by the end, there's a lot more blue in it. It's a little lighter, and it's definitely the coolest of the land masses. Now, as I do progressively make it lighter as I get further back, I don't want to make it too light. These masses of land are upright. And remember, in a landscape, there are certain value planes that you need to be aware of. The sky is always going to be your lightest plane, followed by your ground plane, and then any slanted planes like hills or mountains are gonna be a little darker, and then your darkest values are gonna be upright objects like, you know, these land masses, people, houses, stuff like that. So there is kind of this balancing act that you have to do with making something lighter, but making sure it's still darker than other things. Like when I put in this ocean here, the ocean isn't that light, but it needs to be slightly lighter than these land masses that I just put in. Now I continue the idea of the atmospheric perspective with these rocks here in the foreground. They're gonna be even darker than my closest land mass that I blocked in. Now, as I develop the beach here, I made sure to put in an indicator of these white capped waves. You know, we're working dark to light here, but sometimes it can be very helpful if you have an accent light value, a value that's just a big jump in brightness than pretty much anything else in the painting, like these white capped waves. If you can get something in there, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect right now. You can develop it more later, but getting something in there can help you gauge the rest of the values that you put in the painting. Because you know, whatever else I put in this painting, these white capped waves still need to read as definitely the lightest value. Okay, jumping to the greens and the trees here. These trees are pretty far away, so the green that I'm using is not that vibrant. It's more of an olive green. I've mixed in, you know, a good amount of blue, red, and a little bit of white into it. And the trees the furthest away, they're gonna have even more blue and white in it. It's the same atmospheric concept that we're talking about with the land masses in general. We're just doing it now for the highlights and the greens. Now, don't make these too bright. The most common mistake I see people make when they're putting in the highlights of trees is making them way too bright. You'll be surprised at how similar the lights and the darks in trees are. And also remember, as we get further back in space, the difference between light and dark gets less and less. And putting those in, you can see we got some great depth going here. Now I'm going to put in the sky, which needs to be lighter than everything except our white-capped waves. So you're going to have to thread that needle of making sure that it's lighter than your ocean and your mountains. Now, a side note, if you put in a value and you realize, oh, like this isn't working, it's not light or dark enough, and you think that you need to change other values, change other values. Always be willing to readjust. This is pushing and pulling. Maybe you need to make your mountains darker. Maybe you need to make your ocean a little lighter. This is why it's important to work the painting as a whole and constantly step back and judge the relationships of everything. All right, next we have this street scene that I took in East LA at sunset. Now this is LA at sunset, so there's a lot of atmosphere here. You can almost like see the air. So when I block in these darks of the trees in the foreground, I'm actually gonna make these two bushes on the right that are closest to us just slightly darker to make them sit in front of us a little more. Okay, now with these mountains in the distance here, the key thing here is dialing in the right value. They need to be lighter than the trees that I just put in, but they need to be slightly darker than the sky. So when I'm putting them in, I need to make sure I leave room to put the sky in and have it still be lighter. And there's kind of two major sets of hills here, and I'm making sure the one that's closest to us at the bottom is slightly warmer, a little bit darker. You know, I'm putting more cools, more blues, a little more whites into the mountain in the distance to set it further back. You know, I admit I was playing around with the colors a lot in this. I was constantly slowly adjusting them and altering them and comparing them and just making them feel right. But the main thing is you want them to be lighter and cooler than the trees that you just put in so they sit well behind the trees. Also, I'm paying attention to the relationship between this furthest mountain and the sky. Yes, this mountain is darker, but it's just slightly darker. And I don't want the contrast in my painting between the mountain and the sky to be more than what it is in the image. So I'm constantly checking that relationship between sky and mountain and making sure I've dialed it in correctly. All right, now when I go and put the highlights on these trees, again, look at how dark they actually are. Like the difference between the lights and the darks is not that much. A lot of people put them in way too bright. Also, these trees are in the foreground, so these light values, these light greens are gonna have a lot of reds in them. They're gonna be a lot warmer. Also notice, especially like in these bushes on the right here, how I utilize my brush work. I always try and have an economy of brush strokes, so I identify a shape and then figure out the least amount of brush strokes as possible to fill that shape. So you see, I didn't like dab my brush or make a bunch of little bushy shaped brush strokes. I covered it pretty much in 2 or 3 strokes. And I feel this brush work helps translate the structure of these bushes and trees. All right, now for the street, I always find the ground plane is kind of the trickiest to dial in because it's going to be lighter than everything but your sky. You know, and our mountains are pretty light back here, so it's a very fine needle to thread here, especially with the shadows. It's very easy, I feel like, for people to make the shadows on the ground too dark, especially when you're working from a photo, because photos tend to make the darks too dark and the brights too bright. So be aware of that and be able to dial in the value of your ground plane correctly. Also, I simplified the light pattern here. You know, there's a lot of little shadows and stuff going on with the cars and stuff, but I simplified it. I like the horizontal pattern that this street has in conjunction with the vertical pattern of these bushes and these trees. It also goes along with the horizontal pattern of the mountains. And that's all in all really like this composition. Okay, now for the cars, they are upright objects and they're in the foreground, so they're gonna have like the most contrast out of pretty much anything in this scene. So the darks are going to be pretty dark, the lights are going to be very light. I'm keeping it simple, not worrying about detail. I just want to get the essence of the cars there, and having that high contrast of darks and lights specifically just in these cars is what's going to make them stand out and read. And to top it off, take a nice little palette knife and get some quick little power lines, just picking and choosing which ones I want to better my composition. All right, moving on to the shoreline painting here. First thing I like to do is get my darkest dark, which is deep in this foliage. I lay that out first, knowing that I'm gonna be able to build lighter values on top of that. Then I squint my eyes and block in the colors for the greens of the foliage. Now, as I block in the water, my main concern here is keeping the value, even in these shadows cast on the water, as lighter than the foliage. After putting in the ground, I used kind of the same warmish purple that I used for the ground to indicate a few of the branches in the foliage. Then I mix up a lighter, warmer color to selectively place where I want sunlight to be hitting those branches. Then I put more spots of sunlight on the ground. Now, take note that the only reason that these spots of light are gonna work is if my ground is dark enough. A lot of times I see people try and paint dappled light and it doesn't come out because they didn't establish a dark enough ground to put those light shapes on top of. I actually have a great paint along video of a dappled light scene on my Patreon. I feel my students get a lot out of that. If you want to sign up to be a patron, I'll put a link to where you can do that in the description below. And at this point, it's just a matter of pushing what I've already established here. I had to play around with the water a little bit, pushing the lights and the darks. But this one is all about the contrast between light and dark. Last is another photo that I took of some palm trees in a field at Mayaca State Park in Sarasota, Florida. And first I want to talk about the drawing and show you kind of how I blocked out all of these trees into one big shape. And notice that I'm not repeating any shapes here with the trees or even repeating the spaces between the trees. I'm keeping those varied up to help, you know, the composition. It's just unpleasing to the eye to see perfectly even spaced things. Now, even though I'm keeping this simple and not getting the detail, I'm aware of certain important things, and one of those is where each one of these lines of trees are. So I established the line on which all of the tree trunks are and making sure that each level of trees steps back into space. Also, to help the composition, I simplified this grass in the foreground into two arrow-like shapes, leading us into the scene, but also making sure that they were different in size. So my darkest value are these trees, so I block those out first. Now with the ground in the scene, first thing I'm thinking of is one, it needs to be lighter. The ground plane needs to be lighter than the trees that I just blocked in, so I gotta make sure all the values that I put in are lighter, but in terms of color, I need to be thinking about atmospheric perspective. So these grasses in the foreground are gonna be more saturated, have warmer colors, and as I step back, they're gonna get cooler and cooler until I have these line of trees actually way in the background that are pretty much just straight blue. I'm also simplifying the pattern in the grass. I'm not worrying about painting every little strip or blade of grass. I'm actually breaking it down into these horizontal strips that go nicely with the vertical aspect of the trees. And again, I'm keeping these vertical strips varied in width. Now it's time to go in and start putting in some lighter values in these trees. You know, I got the tree trunks, even though I put in some lighter value for the tree trunks, it's still a shadow value. But up into the trees, I indicate on the right side because that's where the light is coming from, lighter green value. Now here you can see I wanted to have more separation from this foliage in the background and these trees up front. So I put in a lighter, cooler green to push that foliage back. I also found some reddish values that I like to put into the grass. I have one strip that's a little darker and warmer in the foreground, and then another that's a little lighter and cooler in the background. So I keep going and identifying more and more lighter values to build on top of my darker values. By the end, when I put in the sky, I'm making sure that my sky is the lightest value in the painting. I keep it a little warmer and a little lighter down towards the horizon because with skies, it's gonna be warmer and lighter towards the bottom of the sky. I went and pushed back this foliage even more with some more cooler colors to push those back and have more separation. I pushed the yellows more in the grass in the foreground to bring it forward more. And I used some lighter values in the trees to kind of better indicate individual trees where I wanted. All right, so there you go. I hope you learned something. Hopefully you can take away some valuable information that you can use in your own paintings and make them better. Now, if you're struggling to oil paint and you're like, I need some structure, I need some step-by-step instruction, I highly recommend my Foundations of Oil Painting course. That's why I made it. It's over 7 hours of content that you can access at any time. It takes you step by step through what I think are the most important aspects of oil painting. Now, if you're looking for full painting video tutorials, I have like over 60 of them available for like only $9 on my Patreon page, which I'll put a link to in the description below. And if you want to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero here telling you to go get painting.